Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program on Teaching Election 2024 from a bipartisan perspective. What could go wrong? We have three stellar faculty who will share with us today. Professors Mary Kay Cary and Jennifer Lawless will speak about their popular Election 2024 class, and Professor David Leblang will moderate their discussion. Thank you to our partners for this program, the College Foundation and the Miller Center. Should you have a question during this program, kindly enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're recording this program and it will be posted in the Lifetime Learning podcast library in a week or so. Visit engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Now, allow me to briefly introduce our moderator for this conversation. David Leblang is the Ambassador Henry J. Taylor and Ms. Marion R. Taylor Endowed Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics, College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He's the Randolph Compton Professor of Public Affairs at the Miller Center of Public Affairs, where he is the Director of Policy Studies. Leblang is a scholar of political economy with research interests in global migration and in the politics of financial markets. His recent book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023, The Ties That Bind Immigration and the Global Political Economy. In 2015, Leblang was awarded the Outstanding Faculty Mentoring Award by the University of Virginia. On behalf of Lifetime Learning, the College Foundation, and the Miller Center, thank you, David, for moderating this webinar. Welcome, David. The microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Althea, and thank you to you and your team for putting together what I think is going to be a really interesting and engaging event. Let me introduce our two panelists, who are both my colleagues and my friends. We are all on the same floor in the Department of Politics. Jen Lawless is the Leon Reeves and George W. Spicer Professor of Politics, and she is chair of the Politics Department here at the University of Virginia. She's the author of 8 books on a range of topics focusing on American politics. In 2006, she ran for Congress in the Democratic primary in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. Mary Kay Cary is twice over a UVA parent and a very proud alum of the University of Virginia, where she was a major in, I think it was government at the time, or was it politics?
That's correct. That's correct.
Government at the time. She's after graduating, she had an illustrious career as a speechwriter, serving as a White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush, after she served as a senior writer on the Bush-Quayle 1988 presidential campaign. She is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics. Professors Lawless and Cary teach a course called Election 2024, which has a current enrollment of 476 students, which is huge, to say the least. I want us to talk a little bit about how you two go about teaching this topic, this course, how you go about engaging in politics in a bipartisan way. And then I want us to shift and talk a little bit about what you expect in November. So let me begin with some easy stuff, okay, just to kind of get our feet wet. Where did the idea for this course come from? And here, I'll start with Mary Kay, right? And then, we'll kind of go back and forth.
Well, I can brag on Jen's behalf, because she probably won't do it herself. Jen started teaching election, fill in the blank, election 2000, 2004, 2008 at other institutions, I think Brown and American. And we now have the textbook that we use for it that she wrote, but we didn't have that last time. And I think she just had a very lonely time doing that by herself at these other schools. And she arrived at UVA and was the incoming chair of the politics department, and was understandably swamped with all her new duties, and asked John Owen, who's another friend of ours, could she get somebody to co-teach with her and lighten the load? And he said, how about Mary Kate? And I said, me, why would you pick me? And he knew that I was a former Republican campaign staffer, and she was a former candidate herself on the Democratic side. And we thought, let's just own it and celebrate our differences. And so that's how it all came together, was here at UVA.
Awesome.
I would just add that it was also, not only was I becoming department chair, but it was the summer of COVID. And so teaching a really large class by myself as a department chair for the first time on Zoom for the first time just seemed incredibly overwhelming. So my initial response was, let's just cancel the class. But fortunately, we came up with an alternative. And although it was not clear from the beginning that we were going to teach it from a bipartisan perspective, what did become clear as we started laying out the syllabus and thinking about the ways that we could engage guest speakers and connections that we had who were actual political practitioners, that we would really be able to leverage the connections that we have and the different perspectives that we have to make discussing the election more interesting.
So Jen, I just want to follow up on that. I want to ask about how you go about teaching the class, talk a little bit about format, and you had just mentioned that you invite a number of guest speakers. Can you talk about how they engage with the students? Is it on Zoom? Are they in person? How much access do the students have to the really the great lineup of people that you all have engaged in the class?
Sure. I'll give a brief summary and then Mary Kate can fill in all of the blanks that I know I'll leave. So the class is, there are three different components of the class. So 2/3 of the classes meet in person, where we have a regular in-person lecture format. With that many students in the class, we're limited in the extent to which we can answer questions or engage them. Although we'll get into that, there are lots of things we do to try and up their engagement and participation. But about 1/3 of the courses are held on Zoom with luminaries. So we've had Paul Begala and Karl Rove in one session to talk about what they think is going to happen in November. We told the students that they might not know who these people are, but their parents certainly will. We had a top Democratic and Republican pollster come on to talk about the way that they're thinking about election 2024 and how it compares to other elections. We had Bob Barnett, who has trained tons of Democratic candidates in presidential debates, and Ron Kaufman, who's a Republican who has basically run the RNC convention multiple years, come in and talk about what happens as the presidential nomination process narrows and we head toward Election Day. And tomorrow we're actually having a session on strategic communications with a political communications expert from the first Bush administration and somebody else who's the current communications director of the DNC. So what we try to do is in these sessions have the students see the lecture material play out in real life. And the way the format works is the students are all on Zoom so that they can directly engage with the guest speaker. They can ask direct questions, they can engage in the chat, and the guest speakers can see them on the screen as well. So it's a little overwhelming to have almost 500 people on the call, but fortunately the technology allows the person who's speaking to go right to the front page. So it seems more intimate than it probably is.
And that's a function of the fact that the technology in our classroom, we can't put a Zoom screen up in the classroom because then the speakers cannot see the students. So we do this where all the students are basically in their apartments, which is not ideal, but it's the best we can do with the technology we have. And then I would say the third part of the setup we have is that once a week, the students have to do an hour of interactive election activities, and that's part of their grade as well. So we don't have sections. It's too big a class. We have one TA, and so we can't have discussion sections. So in lieu of that, they have to volunteer either for a campaign or be a poll watcher or go to a webinar, things like that that are interactive. We told them they are not allowed to sit in their apartment and watch West Wing with their buddies and count that. But whatever they're doing, they take a selfie of their themselves and turn it into the TA, and they'll have 10 hours of that by the time the class is over. And that seems to be very popular so far. I think they're really enjoying it. A lot of them, they do it together and they'll take a big group shot. And so I think that's been much more successful than 4 years ago.
All of these selfies are uploaded onto discussion boards in the class. So all of the students have access to seeing everything else that the students are doing. So even though they don't all know each other, we're hoping to cultivate a sense of community through this process.
Well, that sounds really amazing. Let's compare today with 4 years ago, right? So you all taught this the first time in 2020. Let's set aside the fact that it was all on Zoom because of COVID. talk a little bit, I'll start with you, Jen, talk a little bit about how teaching this semester, this election, is similar or different from teaching in the fall of 2020.
Well, a lot of things are the same because a large portion of the class is the nuts and bolts of campaigns and elections and how to understand a poll and how to understand and evaluate a debate or a convention or a political speech. And so I would say that when it comes to the actual substance and the political science of campaigns and elections, there isn't that much that's different. But what is fundamentally different is that the class ended in 2020 before what happened on January 6th, before the various lawsuits that the Trump campaign put forward to, undo the result, before we had the famous conversation with Brad Raffensperger, and before there were questions about the transition from one administration to the next. So in some ways, 2020 was, a much simpler time because all of these questions about what would happen if Trump didn't leave, or what would happen if the results were overturned, or what would happen if Congress didn't certify, were all these very far-flung hypotheticals that, it would never even have occurred to us to address. This time around, that's not the case. Now, we haven't gotten to those kinds of questions yet. We're still all ensconced in the minutia of what's going on in the campaign trail, but that will certainly be addressing those kinds of issues should they arise, will certainly be a challenge that we didn't have to confront 4 years ago.
And so, Mary Kate, let me. I wanted to answer to Jen, but I want to kind of push you in a little directions to kind of build on what Jen has said, but also how do you think about, given that you all have done this once before, and given that you all come at this from, as teachers, but also from politically different perspectives, how do you all negotiate disagreement among yourselves, right? Whether you're talking about issues, whether you're talking about polls, whether you're talking about campaign rhetoric, how do you all handle that and model that for students?
So two things that we did, and we make sure that it applies to us as well. We came up with what we call a class agreement. And I did this in my speech writing class, because you can imagine we have similar issues in speech writing with all these different viewpoints and people disagreeing. And so what we did was we took the agreement from last semester from my smaller class, and we put that up, and then the students could answer a survey and add to it. And so the class agreement that we posted said things like, communicate your perspective thoughtfully and with evidence, give others the benefit of the doubt, agree to disagree, be curious, not judgmental, which comes from the great political philosopher Ted Lasso. And most importantly, that all course discussions are off the record. So nobody can quote anything anybody else is saying, no posting of social media, things like that from inside the classroom. And that has really helped a lot. We then opened this up. First day of class was 300 students. By the end of that week, we had 500 students because the word got out. And I think this might have had something to do with it, was that they wanted to hear both sides and that they knew there were some sort of agreements in place of how we're all going to behave. And Jen and I abide by the agreement as well. So the students sent in 175 suggestions for more things to add to the list. My favorite one was hug it out after class. Thought that was pretty funny.
Not happening.
And, so that has really helped us. The other thing we did early in the semester was moral foundations theory, which is Jonathan Haidt's invention, and had them watch the TED Talk and do a questionnaire on it, where they were evaluating their own moral values and deciding which ones were most important to them. And then we could see how everybody else was. And the point of that is that political conversations should not go to, or even start with, right and wrong, good and evil. It should go to the values that you hold dearly. So for example, you could have two people say, I believe very strongly in protecting my family. And they would both be nodding and saying, yes, that's a core value for me. And one person could say, that means I want more gun control. And the other person says, I want to have a gun in my house. And so you can go in very different directions policy-wise, but at least everybody says, yeah, well, we're going to start with a place of agreement and go from there. And so we taught that early in the semester, and I think that's helped as well.
I think that's really powerful. Jen, do you want to add to this?
The only thing I would add is we also have separated the class into two portions. So we have the just the facts, ma'am portion, where we're laying out the political science, we're laying out the things that are not negotiated, that are not our opinions, that are just pieces of information that we want students to understand and learn to be informed consumers regarding the election. And then we have about a quarter of the class dedicated to what we call she said, where we'll give our different takes on the debate or on a set of polls or on which campaign ads we think are most effective. And there we'll inject our own opinions. But it's important to both of us that we really segment the class into these two pieces. First, so the students can see that there are lots of things that are not negotiable, that are not up for grabs, that are just the way that the political science works. And then there's this other piece where two people can have completely disparate views, but have a civil conversation for 10 minutes about those positions.
So I want to ask this about, kind of civil discourse and civil conversation, and really think about this within the context of language. And I ask this very genuinely. We are in a moment where the University of Virginia has issued a statement of institutional neutrality. We've seen all kinds of hubbub, shall we say, surrounding what is said and what should be said or should not be said at a university level. But let's kind of hone in on the classroom, okay? And I'll give you an example, right? So both of you know I teach an immigration class, okay? 2 weeks ago, Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance amplified on social media a statement that Haitians in Springfield, Ohio were stealing and eating dogs and cats. That statement was repeated by Donald Trump during the debate. It was found to be untrue, with even the governor of Ohio, a Republican, saying it was false. Now, I want to use that example to ask two questions. In phrasing the question, as I just did to you two, I used the words untrue and false, okay? I teach a migration class, and in class, I use those words. A student asked me why I didn't call it a lie, right? And I really don't know how to answer that question, right? Part of it was I was afraid that I was making a political statement by calling out something that is untrue a lie. So how do you all negotiate that, right? There's so much that is said in campaign that is exaggeration, hyperbole, and falsehood. How do you all talk about that with your students in a way that is engaging?
I've had this problem before in my political speech writing classes, and I for my entire adult life, I do not like to use the word lie. I don't like to be called a liar. I don't call other people liars. I use phrases like you do. I say, you might not have gotten that correct, or that might not be entirely true, things like that, because I think it really puts people on the defensive very quickly. I think the word lie is a very triggering word. And so I tend to not have it in speeches. I don't like my students to use it in political persuasion. I don't think it works well. So at least when we're on stage, I do not use that word. And I think that that's, I don't know. What do you think, Jen? But that's how I feel. I don't, I try not to do that because I think it's provocative.
Well, I think not all lies are created equal. And when it comes to the allegation that there are Haitian immigrants kidnapping and then eating cats and dogs, I'm comfortable using the word lie, not only because it's been debunked, and not only because it's generated political violence in the town of Springfield, Ohio, but also because even J.D. Vance said that it was unconfirmed. And so I think something like that is different than facts that can be interpreted in multiple ways. I think there, I would say my perspective is this is not true, and here's why. So I think that there's a difference in the, again, I mean, I can't even think of times where I've, from the stage been like, oh my gosh, that's a lie, stop. But I do think that when I think about it systematically, it seems like when there's an objective fact that has been proven not true, and it's not a matter of interpretation, it's not a matter of, well, which month of the GDP are we looking at, but it's an allegation about, somebody doing something like eating a dog, I think that that's different. So, but I do think we are careful. Speaking of the immigration issue, another piece that's really complicated about that is the two parties speak about immigration in two very different ways. And I would never use the word alien, for example. I would only say undocumented worker or illegal immigrant, but Republicans generally use the term alien and do not view it in a derogatory way. And so I think that becomes a challenge in a class when you're teaching from a bipartisan perspective, especially when you're covering campaign ads and statements made, or in a debate, statements made from the two candidates. Like, do you clean up the language from one side when that's the language that side has embraced? So I do think there are challenges there. The ones that are just explicitly factually untrue in some ways, I think, are the easiest ones to dismiss.
Well, let's walk back from that example, right? Because this is one we can say it is factually untrue. How do we then think about exaggerations, right? Or a different, where's the line? And maybe there's not a line, right? But how do we then distinguish? How do you guys distinguish in the class between, well, he's exaggerating, right? Or, oh, she's exaggerating versus that's just blatantly incorrect, or a different interpretation, right, of what occurred, right? You all can see something and you can interpret it from your different perspectives. So how do you kind of not square it, because you're not going to agree, but how do you communicate those kinds of disagreements so that students understand framing, but also persuasion?
So I think there are two things that are relevant here from my perspective. The first is that we rely a lot on data, and we show lots of graphs, we show lots of figures, we show lots of charts, we show lots of polling results, so that the students are constantly looking at evidence. And they might interpret evidence differently, but we've taught them, for example, to consider the source, to look at how questions are worded. When you're thinking about public opinion, to consider the margin of error, to think about question order, to think about the reputation of a particular polling firm or an organization that has released that kind of information. So although we can't tell students what to think, we can tell them how to process information and how to evaluate evidence. And so I think that's one thing. Now, we might look at the same evidence and evaluate it differently, but at least we're all coming from the starting point that we need to look at data to draw conclusions. And then the other thing is sometimes we just disagree. I was thinking about an example from Tuesday where we were talking about the first presidential debate, and Mary Kate said, so obviously we had different views of the extent to which Kamala Harris hit it out of the park. I thought that it was like a home run like we've never seen before, and
not so much. Yeah,
that wasn't really shared. But the thing that was really interesting to me was that one of the things that Mary Kate said initially was that her view of it was that the moderators were basically treating the two candidates differently, and that it was like 3-1. And she made that case. And then my rebuttal of the case was that, that was just not the way that I saw it. I saw them fact checking. And, Trump was just saying more things that needed to be fact checked. And Kamala Harris actually spoke a fewer number of minutes. And so there was a situation where we looked at the exact same debate. We both had, generally, I think like most Americans, most people would say that Harris outperformed Trump, or at least that Trump took the—
Right, I did say that, yeah.
Offered, right.
Yeah, she had the upper hand. Yeah.
Yeah, our assessments of why and how that happened were different. And so I think sharing that with the students and then letting them take the evidence that each of us provided and weigh it to arrive at their own conclusion is totally fair.
So, the way I was raised, my father told us that we had to read the front page of the newspaper before we could read the op-eds and the editorials, and make your own mind up first and then see what the prevailing opinion is. And so we put in the syllabus a list of news sources that we want the students to read almost on a daily basis. And they're the same ones that we use. And it's stuff like Politico Playbook, Axios, Real Clear Politics for the side-by-side op-eds, as well as for the polling. The Gallup Presidential Election Center is very good. Jen likes one called Political Wire. So we gave them all those. And then that's where we get a lot of the stuff that we see off the campaign trail. And so we're not picking stuff from highly partisan, fringy sources. And then the thing that I do in my speech writing class, but it holds true for here, is if, say, President Biden says something on Twitter or X, I'd rather have the students look at what he actually said in the tweet and not what all the reporters are taking out of context or saying what he said. Jen and I disagree on this. I think there's a lot more advocacy journalism now than she does. And so I'm a little more sensitive to that, but I think that's how a lot of people on my side of the aisle feel, that the amount of the story selection and the tone of the coverage is very different than it was even 4 years ago.
I'm going to just remind our audience, which is now up to 501, that I have about 2 more questions, and we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you do have questions, keep adding them to the Q&A box on your Zoom app, or however you're engaging with this program. So I want to talk, or actually I want you all to talk about January 6th, right? Just for a moment. How do you handle that in class?
So far, we haven't discussed it in class. And I don't know where it would really fit in on the syllabus yet, but I'm sure it'll come up at some point. What do you think, Jen?
My assessment, so I think that post-election day, it will certainly come up.
Yeah.
Particularly if Donald Trump loses. If he wins, I think that it's a different set of concerns that a lot of students will have. But as far as January 6th is concerned, it's difficult to discuss because the student, I mean, most of the students watched it in real time. I mean, right, we all watched the footage that day. And I think that what's very complicated about it is that watching it in real time and even listening to the way that elected officials were talking about it that day and the following week looks completely different than the way that a lot of them are talking about it now. And it's difficult to think about how to discuss it when you can watch video footage and you have Republican leaders and Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate calling for stopping this violence. And then you look at those same elected officials today, many of them saying there was no violence. And so that will be very, very tricky. I'm hopeful that because the students watch the footage, it's not like we're describing something that happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where there's this partisan lens through which these events have now been shaped. But I could imagine that that becomes more and more difficult over time when, people will not have experienced it themselves.
I think my take on it in advance, I may reserve the right to change my mind when the time comes. But for now, I think that January 6th was horrible, one of the worst days in modern political history. And however, I also think that a reassuring message to the young people is that the system held, and he did leave office, and a lot of people, 1,000 people, I think, went to jail. The chances of it happening again, I think, are minuscule, because now we all know what to look for. And so I think it's reassuring that the electors certified the results. Joe Biden took office, Donald Trump left. And I think we need to emphasize that. So that's going to be the way I go, because I think we've got to be very careful about the tone we're setting and our expectations and telegraphing that.
So Jen,
Well, yeah,
telegraphing, you just telegraphed that you disagree with Mary Kate on that answer. So
I do. I mean, I think that I think the system barely held, and since then, the number of secretaries of state, the number of people running boards of elections, the number of members of Congress on the Republican side of the aisle who are explicit election deniers has skyrocketed. I think that the people who were sort of holding things together were often not reelected in various capacities throughout the states. And I also think that we are facing a presidential election where Donald Trump today, for example, said that he thinks New York is competitive, and if he loses, it's because of cheating. He said that about California 2 weeks ago. And so he's laying groundwork to gin up this idea that the election is stolen far before we approach that time, and in states that are not even battleground states, which expands the conflict far beyond 2020. And so I'm not confident that all of those pieces are in place to provide the check that they were 4 years ago.
So, and look, I think we have time to discuss this more if there are questions from the audience. I have one last question for you all before I go to the questions that are in the box. Are there issues that you all agreed upon before the semester began that were just off the table, right? Things that you just like, we're not going to discuss this. It's too controversial. It's too what have you. Are there those kinds of issues? Are there those issues? Or
Well,
is everything on the table?
well, 4 years ago, we didn't have Jen's textbook, and the textbook has 48 chapters. And so there's an unlimited amount of very well researched, like we were saying, with graphs and numbers and footnotes and things like that. So we have plenty of material to pick from that we didn't have 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I think we did a class on issues that are dividing America right now. And we sort of thought, we all know what the issues are dividing America. Let's teach them things that are a little more useful in the long run. And so, so we haven't explicitly said we're not talking about X, Y, or Z. We just have more to pick from this time. And I think that's been a gift. But Jen, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, if something comes up, you know, like we don't have a class on abortion or a class on gun control or anything like that. If it's relevant in the campaign trail, or if there are ads that speak to that and we're highlighting what happened, that we'll certainly cover it. The one thing that I said I couldn't negotiate on early on was that when we were identifying guest speakers, I was not okay with any election denier. So none of our guest speakers are election deniers. That's the litmus test that CNN uses. I feel like if it's good enough for CNN, it's good enough for me. And we have no problem. And by the way, we have no problem identifying very conservative Republicans who are completely in favor of Trump, who are also willing to admit that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. So I don't feel like we've lost this whole group of people.
That sound good, Mary Kate?
Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
So go ahead.
So there was a question that was asked. Some of the participants submitted questions beforehand, and there are a number of questions that echo this basic question. The question that was put in beforehand says, and I'm reading verbatim, I am exasperated by the extreme views, policies, and persona of both presidential nominees. What will it take for us voters to have more respectable and moderate candidates from which to choose? What can we do to change the situation? And again, there's a lot of other comments that are really asking, how do we get to a place or back to a place, those are my words, of more normal politics?
Well,
who wants to jump at that one first?
I'll start. There are a few mechanical things that could be changed. For example, we were just talking about this in class yesterday, that if you're an independent voter, in a lot of states, you can't vote in an open primary. And in a closed primary. And so if more states had open primaries, I think that would lead to more moderate candidates, at least in the primary stages. And another thing would be if you had more purple districts but it's really hard to redistrict and get people to agree on how to fix that problem. But if you could wave the magic wand and every district in the country was a purple district, we would go back to a lot more compromise and bipartisanship. But the bottom line that I say to students all the time is politics wasn't always this way. It doesn't have to stay this way. And what it's going to take is for good people to come forward and run for office. And we showed the students polling about how unpopular it is to say, I want to run for office. There's a lot more used car salesmen in the country than there are people who want to run for office. And we got to fix that. I personally blame shows like, what's it called? The one with the upside down American flag. I'm blanking. House of Cards. House of Cards, they portray everybody on the show who's in elected office as total slime balls. And I think our enemies are delighting in that. And that is not the culture we need to get people to step up into public service and see it, as President Bush called it, a noble calling. And we need to get back to that.
I think so first, let me just say, I think House of Cards was so popular because it reinforced what people thought. It didn't plant the seed to think that.
Makes me sad.
But I'd say a couple of, I thought it was an amazing show, except now I can never watch it again because of Kevin Spacey. But I would say that a couple things. First, I think that the redistricting situation gains, a lot of people think that. The problem is that the states are yielding just as extreme candidates for Senate and governor, and there's no districting or redistricting in states, right? So if redistricting would solve the whole problem, or would solve a large part of the problem
In the House, yeah, in the House.
But the reason I'm not convinced that it would solve the problem in the House is because we have the same problem at the state level, and redistricting is not a culprit there. So I'm a little bit less favorable when it comes to the notion that with more independent commissions or a different method of drawing congressional districts, that we'd wind up with significantly different outcomes. For me, I think the issue is that you get what you vote for. And, when we think about the presidential election, for example, this time around, there were many, many candidates running on the Republican side of the aisle. And right up until the end, there was one facing off against Donald Trump who was getting 20% of the Republican vote, even if she dropped out of the race, even when she dropped out of the race. And so, we view that as a major accomplishment. But the reality is that if people were so turned off by Donald Trump, they could have voted for all of these other people. And the same can be said for various Democratic candidates over time. I mean, Joe Biden didn't have a real opponent. Dean Phillips was not somebody that had the money or the name recognition to go nationwide. But from election cycle to election cycle, there have been many, many choices. And I think American voters get tired and coalesce around the person who it seems like is going to win. And so that's part of it. But I do agree that we need more people to think about running for office. And if you want to be really, really depressed, let me just say that based on my own survey research, what we have found when we've asked people who are well-situated potential candidates, whether they'd consider running for office, the people who are the most interested in running on both sides of the aisle are the most extreme, the most ideological, and the most who have no problem with lying or cheating to gain their own advantage and an advantage for their party. So until we fundamentally change perceptions of the nature of politics, that's not going to change. And I don't think that, getting rid of a show like House of Cards is any way, is in any way as powerful as not having men behaving badly on TV the way they often do from both sides of the aisle when you're actually watching Congress. And so I think the prospects are quite bleak.
Let me ask. I know the answer is no, but I'm just going to throw this out as a question. Let's talk about campaign, right? The campaigns. I actually found, Harris starting the race whenever she did was at July. I've lost count. Mm-hmm. So refreshing, right? Yeah. To think, okay, wow, we only have to pay attention from July until November and not 2 years prior. Any possibility of this becoming a new normal? I know I'm asking knowing that the answer is no, but I'm hoping you guys will give me a glimmer of hope.
I mean, I wish. I think if Harris wins.
Yeah, I wish too. Yeah.
I think if Harris wins, that could provide an example of how you might actually be better off with a shorter campaign. There's less time to tear the other side down because you have to build yourself up. There's also less time for voters to become increasingly apathetic and bored. Right now, we have what political scientists call a permanent campaign. Forget about the presidency, even for Congress. The best day of fundraising for the next time is the day after the election this time. And that's just a terrible place to be. Members of Congress, incumbents who are seeking re-election are the most time that they spend doing anything is raising money. And that's for a solid 2 years. So if we could create incentives and maybe somebody winning with a short campaign would help begin to do that, I think voters would appreciate it. I think donors would appreciate it. I think we'd all appreciate it. We suck up the 96 texts and emails that we get every day for 3 months. We're more inclined to unsubscribe when we've been getting them for 18 months.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think that's adding to the voter fatigue is this permanent campaign, and other countries don't do it this way. We do, and I think there's plenty of opportunity. If somebody did that, I think a lot of people would love it, but I don't know if it's possible.
Well, and so then we get to, there's a question, actually a number of questions in the chat that are asking about Harris, right? So Harris begins running, she becomes the de facto nominee in January. She wasn't vetted by a long primary Her policy positions are potentially less well known. So I want you all to both talk about how that dynamic influences the election. But I also want to ask a pointed question at the end, which is, do you think that affects the volatility of Harris's polling because there's less of a record in terms of polling asking questions about Harris?
You know, I've got to say that she's among the most qualified presidential candidates we've ever seen. She's been vice president for 4 years. She was in the Senate. She was attorney general 3 times. She was a district attorney. Her record's pretty clear. Now, the extent to which she wants to differentiate specific policy positions from the Biden administration is more nuanced. But there aren't a lot of questions about, I don't think there should be that many questions when people say, well, I don't really know what her economic plan is, or I don't really know what her her view on immigration is. I find that very, very striking, for a couple of reasons. The first is she's cast a lot of votes and made very clear statements about both of those things. And I think that she's being held to a standard that not only don't we hold Donald Trump, I mean, make America wealthy again, I've said many times, is not an economic plan. It's a nice goal. She's being held to well, she doesn't have this 20-point plan. But the other thing is she's being treated like she has not been second in line for the presidency for the last 4 years, which is kind of stunning to me. And so, I think that the short amount of time in some ways it limits her because it allows these questions to emerge, and she doesn't have 18 months or 24 months to craft the perfect answer. But there's something somewhat unsettling, and that just seems a little bit icky to me about the way that they're being raised, and this general argument that she didn't earn this right, that she got the nomination through some shady, seedy process. Nothing like that happened. Joe Biden dropped out of the race. She said that she was running. Nobody else threw their hat in, and delegates elected her as their nominee. That's totally consistent with party rules. It's completely consistent with the way that campaigns and elections work in this country. And she has the experience. I think the volatility in the polls, in part, initially, was a huge, huge sigh of relief on the part of Democrats that Joe Biden was not the nominee. I think that initial boost would have happened to anyone. And then she's run a really, really careful and effective campaign, which, by the way, is a lot easier to do when you only have to do it for 90 days. You have a lot less time to make mistakes. So I don't want to say that she's the best campaigner we've ever seen. She's had the best set of circumstances that any presidential candidate in recent history has been blessed with having to endure.
Mary Kate?
So I think it's troubling that she dropped out of the 2020 race before she ever got to Iowa. So she never got any votes on her own before Joe Biden put her on the ticket. And now we've come to this cycle, and basically the party insiders chose her. And the fact that she's never had to carry a primary on her own is troubling to a lot of people as far as how the process went. The bigger issue in my mind is that she had a very clear record, Jen is right, as a senator, and she was one of the most liberal senators to the left of Bernie Sanders. And so now all of a sudden she's getting asked on her policy positions. They put out the Democratic platform for the Democratic National Convention, and they didn't edit it and take out Joe Biden's name. So all of the policies say President Biden's going to do this, that, and the other thing. And it makes you wonder, well, is she going to do that, or is she doing something else? And she won't really answer these questions. And so when Bernie Sanders said the other day, sort of the quiet part out loud, when somebody asked him on one of the Sunday shows, how do you reconcile what she's saying she's going to do now with what she's done in the past? And he said, well, that's because she's a pragmatist and she's saying what she needs to get elected. That is very disturbing to people on my side of the aisle, because you say, well, what is she going to do when she gets elected? Do we trust her now? Like, which one is true? And so there's a lot of concern about what her plans are, because there's so much conflicting information, and she's not doing the press conferences. She's done some interviews, but it's unsettling, I think, to a lot of people, because she seems to be saying two things at the same time.
So let me
Okay,
ask-
so I have
go
to
ahead.
respond.
Go ahead, Jen.
So political scientists spend a lot of time calculating ideological scores and measures. And it's simply not true. Not only is she not the most liberal senator we've ever had, not only was she not the most liberal senator when she served, not only is she not to the left of Bernie Sanders, but there were 15 senators to the left of her. And so it's a great talking point. So is that she was border czar, a term that actually never existed until Donald Trump created it. These are just things that are not true. But because they are consistent with an argument that the other side wants to make to debunk her and to diminish her and to suggest that the Democrats cheated, which is completely consistent with what Donald Trump wants people to believe should he lose on election day, they garner attention. But as a political scientist who relies very heavily on these various measures, and there are lots of them, there's just no evidence to suggest that she's as liberal as she's been perceived. And there are many, many different metrics, and on all of them, that's the case.
But so I want to go back to something that Mary Kate said a second ago, right? And ask both of you this question, right? So Mary Kate, you said, a concern on your side of the aisle is that you don't know what Kamala Harris is going to do once she gets into office, because she may just say whatever she needs to in order to get elected, and then when she gets into office, she may do something else. I want to ask this question very genuinely. As I will say this as somebody who studies immigration. Joe Biden, in my opinion, said what he needed to do, what he needed to say in order to get elected, and then he walked completely away from all of those promises he made on the campaign trail. I would imagine Donald Trump is in the same boat. I mean, the guy's talking about putting a 200% tariff on everybody, right? Because it's a popular point. Politicians do this, right? And so I'm curious how we square this. And let's talk about this both within the context of what we observe on the campaign trail, but also how you talk about this in class, right? Because it is the case, we could look at every politician and come up with a list of things that they said that they would do on the campaign trail, and then they flipped when they got into office, either because they couldn't or they didn't want to, or because it wasn't politically expedient, because they were looking 4 years down the line, right? So how do we talk about political efficacy and efficiency versus living up to one's promises that one makes? And again, think about this both in the classroom and then, as you guys are political analysts.
I mean, I think in the classroom, I'm pretty, I basically am pretty cynical about the way that we should view campaign ads, the way that we should view talking points, the way that we should view, the messages coming out of particular campaigns. And part of that is, and one of the things that I try to teach is that on the campaign trail, you're a single-minded seeker of re-election or election in the first place. And so you don't want to say anything that's totally going to damn you later on. And you are going to have to figure out how to reconcile these inconsistencies. But I've become increasingly cynical because it doesn't seem like there's much punishment anymore for candidates who flip-flop. I remember in 2004 at the Republican National Convention, on one of the nights, the delegates all held up flip-flops like that you wear at the beach to make fun of John Cary for flip-flopping. And they ran this great ad called Windsurfing, where Cary, trying to appear as a normal person, was windsurfing in Nantucket. And like every time the wind blows, he's going in a different direction. And they're showing him that he flipped on these issues. Now, it really doesn't matter. I can't remember the last time a candidate was really doomed for flipping. And I think a perfect example is, when J.D. Vance said that he has evolved and he now realizes that he was wrong about Donald Trump, so nothing he said counts. He now thinks that Trump showed him the error of his ways. That was accepted and that was okay. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Like maybe we do want politicians to evolve, but I'm pretty cynical about it just because I do think we've reached a point in time now where the general sense among the American public is that politicians lie, that candidates don't tell the truth, that they say anything that's politically expedient. And so they're not really held accountable because that's just, Thursday. And so, the way that I think about it is, and especially in the classroom, is let's look at whether this messaging would be effective and for whom, but not so much, why do you think this is, why do you think they switched their positions? Because my general sense is like, we know why. So I know that's cynical.
Mary Kate?
So a lot of the stuff I do outside the classroom with Think Again and some of my other projects are all about open-mindedness, listening to other people's views, being intellectually humble, that you might be wrong and that it's okay to change your mind. And so I'm in favor of that because I think people tend to get really dug in lately. However, we showed these ads, the John Kerry's windsurfer ad, we just showed him Tuesday in class. There was one that Michael Dukakis did about Dick Gephardt, where Dick Gephardt is flipping in the air back and forth as they show each policy he's flipping. And it's a guy in an acrobat in a suit that looks like Dick Gephardt. But you used to have a much higher penalty in politics for flip-flopping. And that seems to have gone away, which is kind of paradoxical to me, because in the old days, before social media and 24-hour news, people could say one thing in the primary and another in the general and tack to the middle to get elected. And there's much more documentation of what they're saying earlier now. So you'd think the flip-flopping stuff would still have a cost to it politically. And it doesn't seem like it as much lately. And certainly with what people on my side of the aisle see as Kamala Harris flip-flopping, all of a sudden, all these people on TV on the left are saying, wow, this is so fabulous that she is changing her views. And, this is an evolution and this is fine. But I still think there's a lot of us who are like, you can change your mind on something here or something there. But when you do it across the board on so many things at the same time, that's the problem, I think.
Can I just ask, like, on what is this across the board on so many things?
I mean, I think she's changed her mind on guns. She originally said she was going to do mandatory buybacks of guns. Then she all of a sudden announces she's a gun owner, which I think they had to walk back.
She's always said she was a gun owner.
But she's now not saying she's doing mandatory buybacks anymore. I think that's off the table. The economic stuff, she was all in on Bidenomics, and now she won't go anywhere near it. I think that's
also not true. Her economic policies are entirely consistent with Biden's, and she's added specificity about additional tax breaks. She's not using the term Bidenomics because her last name isn't Biden, but there's no policy shift there. I just don't understand. I'm sorry.
And no tax on tips, which by the way, I'm very worried on both sides. If they implement that no tax on tips, we're just going to have to pay tips to everybody at all the time. Like,
okay, but do you think it should be but you think that no taxes on tipping, which is probably the 907th most important issue to the average voter, because she adopted that position that she didn't hold in the past, that's flip-flopping? I think a flip-flop is when you hold one position and then you switch it. Not having had a policy that was specific to a certain set of circumstances 8 years ago or 15 years ago doesn't mean that's a flip-flop. And I just think we have to be careful when we evaluate what the candidates stand for and how we talk about it, because I think it's common on both sides to make these broad generalizations that don't actually bear out when we look at specific policies.
I'm going to ask if we can set that aside for a moment. Because we're running out of time, and I apologize. I want to talk about, or ask you all to talk about, how do we bring what you all are doing in the classroom out of the classroom, right? So a number of people have asked, what do we do, right? How do we kind of make the progress that hopefully you all are making in the classroom? How do we do that for folks who don't take your class, who are not at the university? Mary Kate, you talked a little bit about Think Again. I can give you 30 seconds to talk about that project, but I'd love for us to kind of end on a note where we talk about what we can do in our communities to kind of have these kinds of exchanges. I'll give Mary Kate the first shot at that.
Like I said, this classroom agreement, it really goes a long way if the rest of us in the rest of our lives can be curious and not judgmental. And it's not about winning and losing. It's not about good and evil. It's talking about the values that we all share. And then why is path A or path B a better way to enforce that value? I think is a great thing. In terms of our communities, there's a number of really great national organizations that have sprung up to try and deal with this. And one of them is called Braver Angels, and they do community town hall style. They say debates, but it's not like winning and losing and for and against and all that sort of thing. It's community conversations about issues that are important to people. And you address a moderator instead of each other, and that takes the temperature down. So that's just one example. There's plenty of organizations around that are concerned about this as well. And I think there's a lot of a good work being done on the ground, and you just have to start asking around in your neighborhood what people are doing. And I think there's plenty of opportunities because there's a lot of people concerned about this.
I'm gonna give you another 30 seconds to mention, because there might be people online who are super interested and will attend the Disagree with a Professor event.
Oh, yes.
That is going to be held.
Yeah, we found at Think Again, we found that 75% of UVA students have never disagreed with a professor. And so we thought we would provide free pizza in the rotunda, and you could disagree with a professor who's not necessarily your professor in your classroom, but you could get experience doing that. And so the professors each bring 3 controversial statements they are willing to defend. And David was with us at the last one, and you brought the best lighthearted statement. Would you like to share what it is?
I'm trying to.
I remember it.
Yeah, please. I can't remember his name.
Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling is the. Yeah, to finish.
You said Ryan Gosling, who played Ken in the Barbie movie, is the greatest actor of our time.
No, of his generation.
Oh, of his generation.
Here,
okay.
Of his generation.
And that was highly controversial. A lot of people wanted to.
I will defend that. I will defend.
Students loved it. Students loved it. So we got to do more stuff like that. Get them talking. Get them learning how to do that. Because after COVID, I think we got to show them how to put the phone down, argue with evidence. Make a case for what you believe in, and that's part of growing up.
All right, Jen. Last word.
I mean, I would say that if, to the extent that we can take the way that we're covering the election in the classroom and encourage students to do that outside the classroom, we're effective. I mean, there are 2 things in the classroom agreement that we have really tried to emphasize. So the first is argue with evidence, and that means asking questions. So, for example, when Mary Kate just made a statement about Kamala Harris, and I said, well, what are the examples? I genuinely, what are those examples based on? And then that can generate a conversation where sometimes people realize, oh, there are things I didn't realize, or other people will think, oh, maybe that really was blown out of proportion. That wasn't really what happened. And so teaching the students how to evaluate evidence so that they can have those conversations, I think is really, really important. And the second thing is, one of the students wrote in that they think that avoiding talking points is really key. And I think that in a lot of ways that is too, because everything that people don't like about politics that they see on these panels on MSNBC and CNN and Fox News, to the extent that I can be an advocate for Kamala Harris when we get to the she said portion of our class, and Mary Kate can be an advocate for the Trump campaign when we get there. As long as we're still talking as us, as Jen and Mary Kate, and not as surrogates for these campaigns, I think that advocacy piece is something that the students actually appreciate, because they've just seen us agree on 80% of what we just covered in that class. And then at the end, we're going to say, okay, we have this same knowledge base, and now we're going in different directions, and here's what we think and why. But tomorrow we're going to come back and we're going to agree on that other 80% again. So, to the extent that that message can be modeled and students can see that you can advocate for a candidate, but still be an objective professor teaching facts, will go a long way.
I agree.
Thank you both. Let me just conclude by saying a word of thanks to Jen and to Mary Kate, not just for sharing the experience, but I think for modeling what we really need more of, which is intellectual humility, right? The willingness to go online, to go in front of, well, now 438 people and set yourself up to be disagreed with, right? That takes a lot, right? It doesn't take arrogance. It takes a willingness to say, I'm going to question how I see the world. And I think this is a great example of what we try to do in the classroom as a whole and what we should do more of in the community. So Althea, thank you and your team for giving us the opportunity to bring this conversation to 500 people.
Well, thank you. And it's actually a lot more than that that'll tune into the video after today. So Jennifer, Mary Kate, David, thank you so much. Thanks for hugging it out after this program as well. But thank you for allowing us to be your students today and listen in on very popular class. So thank you. Thank you so much. So you can go ahead and turn off your video and
Thanks for having us.
your sound. Yeah, absolutely. So audience, thank you for being with us today. This program was recorded, so feel free to listen to it in our vodcast library in a week or so. It'll be available, and share it with friends. We look forward to you joining us at a future program. Next weekend, More Than the Score will be live and in person at Alumni Hall. We'll be discussing disruption or evolution, the future of electric vehicles and the U.S. auto industry. And that's on Saturday, October 5th, and live in person and also online around the world. Please visit our website for additional programs and also our online resources at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Again, thank you, faculty, and thank you, audience, for joining us. Stay well.